Welcome to the Evolve Voices podcast, a platform to hear about the fascinating stories behind the people that power global commerce. I'm your host, Jade Maravillas, GTM advisor and the Asia and Europe host of Evolve Voices. Asia isn't just the largest continent. It's probably the most fragmented and challenging region in the world, with billions of people, hundreds of languages, and varying degrees of commerce maturity. But it's also one of the most innovative and rewarding markets if you get your strategy and delivery right. No one knows this more than Patrick Deloy. A true pioneer of the Asian direct-to-consumer e-commerce industry, he founded Bluecom, a leading system integrator bringing Western brands into China and Southeast Asia, which exited to Dentsu in 2016. He now runs several ventures, including ComConsult, a strategic growth in commerce AI advisor to brands and retailers who want to make sure that they use AI most effectively in their day-to-day operations. In this episode, we go back in time when social commerce meant Facebook listings and cash on delivery, to the present-day prevalence of live shopping in Asia, to the near future with AGI. Hope you enjoy listening to this as much as I did recording it, but for now, here's Patrick Deloy. Patrick, I've known you for quite a while now, but I've also know that you've been in Asia a lot longer than that. So can you give us a little overview of what brought you from Europe to Asia and how you ended up founding Bluecom?
Well, yeah, I have a pretty long history in Asia in general. I'm originally from Germany, but I came to Hong Kong about 20 years ago now. And it was really my first touch point with Asia. It was quite opportunity driven at that time. I had an opportunity to work in Hong Kong, and that was pretty shortly after I finished uni. And even though that wasn't in tech, but I've always been kind of a tech person. So what I started with actually very early on, because if you're familiar with Hong Kong, and especially during that time, we talk about 15, 20 years ago, it just felt very entrepreneurial as well, really a can-do place. So very early on, I started to quite organically build a small team to create custom web projects for clients, global clients. And we did this for a while, but then we noticed something. There was really a shift that happened, and it happened very quickly. Because after I moved to Hong Kong, I should spin the story a little bit further. I actually moved to Guangzhou about a year after that, which was really now it's a tier 1 city in China, but it was really a city in the making at that time. A lot of construction going on. It was quite obvious at that time as well, some of the shifts that are happening in China, especially around e-commerce. And it was at that time where I think the first e-commerce platform really at that time in China was Taobao, which was already very popular because it was initially it was touted as a little bit as an eBay alternative. As we all know, eBay famously did not succeed in China for various reasons, but it started as a C2C platform, right? Customers selling products, offering products to other customers. And obviously it was quite basic. Right? You maybe show interest in a product, and then you would meet the seller, and because there wasn't much online payment either. It was a very early time when it comes to...
What year was this then?
Must have been around 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
Because Taobao has been around about 2 years, I think, around that time. So again, it has grown, tremendously already. It was very popular. One of the problems I remember that Taobao had in these early days was a lot of people knew that if you wanted to buy a branded product, a supposedly branded product, there were just a lot of counterfeits, right? A lot of fake products. And this is also where, and I think that must have been around also 2011, 2012 when Tmall started, right? And that was one of the first platforms that, first of all, advertised with real and genuine products that actually worked with brands as well. So it's really a little bit of a prototype, together with Amazon, which obviously started in the US first and Western markets, for a marketplace that worked directly with brands and provide a lot of the other services as well later on in terms of advertiser, in terms of logistics, warehousing, etc. But this is really where it all started, and this was just China. I mean, Southeast Asia was not even at that stage yet. I think some of the early movers like Lazada, I think they did not start before probably 2012, 2013 in Singapore. But it changed just very fast, right? So it became very obvious to me, rather than just doing something that a lot of other people are also doing. If you do general custom web development, you're in competition with a lot of other development shops. But instead, what we decided to do is really to focus on that trend and to work with retailers to actually build the e-commerce channel and really participate in this e-commerce boom of more and more customers. And it was a rapid growth rate in the beginning, doing their first online purchase. I'm getting more and more used to actually buying products directly online. And then also all the other things happened very quickly in terms of online payments. They became more convenient. Some of the integrations as well. Omnichannel wasn't really well known at that time yet. It's just very commonplace, right? But it was still very early stages. But yeah, this is how we grew that business, which we called Bluecom at that time. Was a little bit of fortuitous timing as well, right time, right place, because we basically grew that business from 0 to about 300 people within about 4 years, right? So it was really a very rapid growth on the back of this overall growth in the market. And it really started in China. And at that time, we actually built our initial team in Shanghai. This was where most of the brands were also located. And we had an office in Hong Kong. And then we just very quickly expanded into a couple of other locations as well. Singapore, we had a big team, tech team in Vietnam, Australia, etc. So basically covering the whole of East Asia. We sold that business. Actually, we were acquired then by Dentsu 2016, and we basically brought in all this e-commerce capability into Dentsu, which was at that time also struggling with some of the changes that were happening and building this organically. That was our sole focus. So we've been able to grow in this space very, very quickly and bring in this capability into Dentsu.
Curious to find out, you guys were quite an early mover in this space, doing e-commerce integrations for retail in Asia. Can you paint us a picture of what that landscape was, who the players were? There were lots of opportunities, but also I'm pretty sure lots of challenges. Personally, I was also working in online payments around that time, and trying to convince companies to invest in it was a lot harder back then than it is nowadays.
Yeah. Well, I think nowadays, obviously, no one needs a justification anymore for selling products online. That maybe was a thing back then, but it was also because sometimes there were channel conflicts, especially some of the distributors or retailers that had a certain structure already set up in terms of how they worked with some of their business clients. If we talk about B2B commerce, right, was just set in a way that kind of disincentivized the setup of a direct-to-consumer online channel. So again, it's not really a topic anymore nowadays because no one can argue against online commerce anymore, naturally. But back then, sometimes it was still something that held back maybe some companies, some retailers, some merchants to move forward a little bit more quickly. Again, China has been really a trailblazer in this regard. Some other more mature markets, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, they were maybe a little bit earlier in terms of their direct-to-consumer online commerce setup, because it was easier for them maybe to use some of the technologies and integrations from other markets. Especially in these countries, credit cards have been already very prevalent, right? And they obviously from very early days have made online payments easier. But in markets like China, where very few people have credit cards, right? Not even to talk about Southeast Asia, where not only very few people have credit cards, but a lot of people are also unbanked, right? They don't even have a bank account. And that naturally posed a big challenge. So a lot of the initial commerce as well, when we talk about e-commerce in the early days, I think it was, and you know this as you worked in payment, right? It was 80-90% cash on delivery, right? That's how it all started. Or when it came to C2C, people were just meeting up and exchanging basically cash. But obviously that was not a convenient way at all. I think it was both because the payment infrastructure was lacking, and there was still a trust factor that was not always there, right? So sometimes people wanted to order the product first, especially if you were new to online commerce, right? They wanted to see that they received the goods, maybe check them first, and then, hand over the cash to the delivery driver. But it's not effective at all. That obviously changed very quickly in China with the emergence of especially QR code payment. I mean, there was some integration with bank accounts as well. But QR code payments really have advanced and changed, the landscape drastically. And obviously this has also swapped into Southeast Asia and other markets, right, where credit cards are not very prevalent. And then there's a host of other things to be said about a couple of other things. Logistics, for example, which has been a challenge in most markets, including China, including Southeast Asia. Again, for China, maybe a little bit easier because it's mostly mainland based, a little bit more challenging in countries like the Philippines or Indonesia, where we talk about many, many islands and very remote towns and villages. A lot of the structure there changed as well to actually make this all possible. I would say one thing as well, which was also a key factor for us, especially in the early days, to be successful in terms of helping brands with their direct-to-consumer channels, as opposed to the marketplaces, because there were a lot of companies that focused on helping brands to succeed on Tmall or Lazada and other marketplaces. We focus mostly on the D2C channel because we always believed that it was very important for retailers to have their direct-to-consumer channel to generate first-party data, make sure that they are in full control of their product strategy, their promotion strategy. But what has helped us a lot, especially in the early days, is that there were some technology innovations. Right? Initially, the platform that we focused on in the early days, and again, this was just a year or two after it actually launched, was Magento, and that was a huge shift in the direct-to-consumer platform world, because before Magento there was plethora of other platforms, but they were either somewhat incomplete, difficult to handle, often insecure as well. There were a lot of security issues, right? Breaches. So Magento was one of the first, if not even the first platform that was from the ground up really built as a modern e-commerce platform. And that time it was really a big shift. And then we have seen other platforms as well that again shifted the landscape, like what used to be Demandware, right, and became Salesforce Commerce Cloud, which was one of the first cloud-based e-commerce platforms, right? And they've grown very quickly among retailers. And at some point, because we made these early bets, which turned out to be, the right bets, and working, for example, with Demandware in a very early stage when they grew very quickly in the region, right? So at some point we worked with 80% of the Demandware brands in East Asia, right? So that worked out quite well for us. Yeah.
That over 10 years after that whole e-commerce transformation journey, most of these brands already have a direct-to-consumer play for their e-commerce, right? How has that changed the landscape, and is there anything next for these brands to adapt?
I think there's always movement, right? And I think the pace of change is definitely not slowing down. And I've seen it all firsthand, right? I can compare, when we 15 years ago, like when we spoke to a brand and they wanted to set up their direct-to-consumer channel, it was actually a pretty straightforward conversation. It was like, here's the requirements that we have. We would build maybe a proposal of 20 to 50 pages, right, with all the functionalities and some of the customizations, integrations, etc., localizations, especially in East Asia. So obviously all of this was very, very relevant. And then we would build it for a couple of months, right? We said, okay, maybe, your site, your e-commerce site will be ready in 4 or 5 months. First of all, everything has to be designed, right? And everything developed, etc. This is not working anymore nowadays, right? Everything has to be super agile. And I think nowadays, no client would accept a tech project be fully functional, ready only in, 3, 4, 5 or 6 months, right? Because the pace of change has become so quick. And also the demand for value realization is just so much higher, right? So now it's much more of an incremental process nowadays, where smaller steps are made. Sometimes tests are made. A/B test is a classic example to test the impact on user experience and conversion of certain changes, but also for features and functionalities. Like, and again, the marketplaces have done this already for a long time. I think Amazon has become quite famous by doing hundreds of changes every day, small parts of the system, and see how users react to them. But this has become more and more accessible to many retailers, also small and medium-sized enterprises. I think the more complex technology becomes, the easier it actually becomes for, brands or the end user to use it without having to activate a big team to support, handing over a lot of money to, implement and customize. Now, any brand can set up a decent e-commerce website with a decent design and based on best practice user experience principles within minutes. Was not the case 15 years ago. Even for payments, everything had to be custom made, custom integrated. I think we see strategy-wise as well that maybe even some of the SaaS companies as they exist nowadays will be superseded at some point by, purpose-built programs that are created with generative AI. Just companies describing what they need, what fits their specific business case, the existing platforms they have, the integrations they need, and then purpose-built just very quickly and very little manual input and not a lot of need for a big team. But let me say this as well, specifically for Southeast Asia. I've been talking a lot about China because in a way it has been a trailblazer just in so many regards. It was always, and this is aside from the bifurcation that we have nowadays, we're almost like then in two different universes and there's a little bit of a barrier, and China is this kind of its own ecosystem, right? And then a lot of the rest of the world, but some of the innovations as well that has come from both regions, right? In terms of direct-to-consumer tech, in terms of payment, in terms of logistics, has really enabled Southeast Asia to innovate and grow, significantly in the last decade or so, right? 2015, it was still pretty insignificant. Singapore itself, of course, tiny market, somewhat developed when it came to e-commerce. But now we see Tokopedia and others like in Indonesia, in the Philippines, Lazada, Shopee has been really unprecedented. And it's because of these marketplaces that have established some of the trust, which shouldn't be underestimated. If you're like a first-time online shopper and you've never ordered online, and we say this nowadays, almost it's like a foregone time because almost everyone we know personally has ordered at least something online already. But 10 years ago, and many people in Southeast Asia haven't made a first online order yet. So they really had to, first of all, experience it, maybe set up their profile, but also build up this trust, right? Know that whatever they pay, they're actually getting as well. And then they're not just transferring money to an unknown entity. The marketplaces, again, have helped there as well because they've established this initial trust. They've initiated the payment processes that we know nowadays together with the payment gateways. I've done a lot of the piping integration with the local banks in Southeast Asia, helping a lot of people who did not have credit cards to pay with other means, with the online wallets, and then the logistic, which really had to be built from ground up for a lot of the e-commerce companies outside of the big metropolitan centers like Bangkok or Manila or Jakarta, and that has really just enabled that growth.
Let's talk a little bit about the differences between countries or regions within Southeast Asia. So one of my, I would say, pet peeves is looking at a region as a region. So let's just say China's China, right? But China's also one country that is huge, and you have several different regions within China that have different languages, different cultural profiles, but also different shopping preferences. And then you go into Southeast Asia. It's a region, but it's made up of several different, very culturally disparate countries, right? As someone who's worked in this region for a long time, can you give us some tips to really localize for every country or for every region that is within APAC?
Well, let me say this first. I think, and this is really, I think, a positive development. A lot of the business that we had with Bluecom was actually based on educating a lot of international brands, on how to be successful in a lot of these markets, right? And again, China 15, 20 years ago, it was a big black box, right? For a lot of brands. They knew there was huge opportunity, but they were not really sure how to address it. Southeast Asia, similar to a certain degree. But I think what's positive nowadays, a lot of these international brands, I think they have come to realize as well exactly what you said, right? That we call it one region, obviously, China, Southeast Asia, which is even more atrocious, right? Because these are really different countries, right? So different regions in China also do, different obviously in terms of their consumer expectations, but at least, the technology you would use is the same. But in Southeast Asia, the profile can look very different from country to country. I think something that has changed positively is a lot of the, international brands, and I'm mostly referring here to big Western brands, for example, that went into the market, have realized as well that maybe it's not the best thing to just helicopter in someone who's maybe very experienced on that retail and commerce, but is not really familiar with the local market. Again, we've seen this a lot until maybe I would say until like 5+ years ago. But I think, and maybe COVID had a hand in that as well to, for the brands to realize that, first of all, more and more really capable, local people have become available as well, to help the brands, right? Again, this maybe wasn't so much the case 10, 15 years ago, right? So now it's, for companies, it's become much easier to actually hire very capable local people to actually drive their retail and commerce strategy. And actually, they're much more familiar with the local market user behavior. And I'm talking about really differentiated user behavior, expectations, and requirements as well. Sometimes also legal requirements, right, in each of the markets, just because they are also themselves online, shoppers, obviously, in each of these markets, right? So, and just to give you some very basic example, again, this is something we had to, 15, 20 years ago, educate, Western brands. But for example, during the checkout process on a direct-to-consumer e-commerce site, the standard process would be you have first name, last name, you have the address, and then the payment, and then maybe billing address, and then checkout, choose delivery option, and checkout. But in China, for example, the process always had to be a little bit different, right? I mean, again, very simple things, but for example, you don't necessarily make a distinction between first name and last name. It's all like 2 or 3 characters or so, right? So, people were required legally, they had to be allowed to ask for a legal invoice, which had to be purpose printed as well. Back then, nowadays, it's all online, right? But all these integrations had to be made locally, and Western brands, had to familiarize themselves with that. Nowadays, I think there's a lot more trust into the local team, and the local team would drive a lot more of that strategy. And part of that is because they've become more powerful because they generated more revenue. But notwithstanding, these changes, positive changes, to your earlier point, there's still a lot of details that need to be observed in each of the markets in terms of sometimes legal requirements. And again, China is in a league of its own there, right? Where, obviously also with a technical
with
availability,
the firewalls, yeah.
Well, all of this, right? So again, notwithstanding that, but Southeast Asia as well, markets like Thailand or Vietnam, etc., have different requirements in terms of labeling rules for returns, for example, what customers are able to return in terms of products, purchases they made, cooling off periods that need to be provided. And then obviously local market payment options, right? They're very different from market to market. There's not one single, that would be credit cards, but again, credit cards are not very common in Southeast Asia, right? So it's really market by market in terms of the payment methods that are used. So they're very specific, and that is beyond everything else when we talk about, language and some of the customer expectations and requirements.
So let's shift a little bit based on what you mentioned earlier. You mentioned when technology starts becoming a lot more complex, then it actually makes it easier for brands and consumer, right? And what does that mean for people or companies like yourselves? So we didn't touch on this, but because I've known Patrick for a while, after you exited Dentsu, you decided to start again as an entrepreneur, and now you have ComConsult as one of your many ventures. It is a commerce consultancy. 2 questions there. First, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to, but also based on what you mentioned earlier, I wanted to find out with generative AI, with more technology making it a lot easier for people to self-serve, what does that mean for companies like ComConsult, and has that changed your strategy from your Bluecom days serving these brands?
Depends really on how you look at it and what you make out of it. There can be either a blessing or a curse, right? Often they're seen a little bit as a curse for, maybe more established brands. There used to be a golden time for certain technological changes, right, that have created new opportunities for brands that were really taking advantage of these changes. So some examples again, I mean, even when direct to consumer commerce was still very young, right? So if you were one of the early online only brands that basically created a brand purely online, that was a great time, right? To be in that space, because again, competition was still fairly manageable. Online marketing was, not as expensive as it is nowadays. And it was just more challenging for a lot of, people or even established brands to build their direct-to-consumer channel. So this gave a lot of space for direct-to-consumer brands that operated online only, didn't have all the costs of, their retail channel, their existing operations and all that structure maybe that held them back in terms of their sales agents, incentivizations that maybe didn't work for the direct-to-consumer channels, holding them back, right? And that obviously has enabled brands like, $1 Shave, like these brands that have been super successful at that time. Similarly, there was a time when, for example, influencer-led or content creator-led commerce, was still very young and not very, widespread and important as it is nowadays, where some brands that have very successfully used, content creators at a very early stage, there was not so much competition yet for some content creators, have become very successful and have grown very quickly. So all I want to say is technological changes can be both a challenge, but they also open up new opportunities. And this is how we also try to look at them together with some of the brands that we're working with. You mentioned ComConsult, which I'm actually running with a colleague of mine who also previously was at Dentsu. Something that I'm quite convinced of is these existing marketing agencies might not be in the best position to be at the forefront of these changes as well. Because similarly to established retailers that have been held back by some of their structure and the way they generated their revenue, it's not so different to what we're seeing right now with some of the established ad companies, right? And this is not even a secret, right? Everyone can see that the big ones, including, I don't need to name them all, but the top 5 ad agencies are struggling. They're struggling with, some of the traditional business that typically has brought in a lot of the profitability, high margins is breaking away, right? Because that is moving more and more to the client side, becomes easier and easier to manage, right? Or, the platforms enabling the management, while some of the new trends and changes might not provide the same margins, at least initially, right? And might require some investment as well. Yeah. And this is general trend. I think it's not specific only to commerce, but I think that's something that all companies have to grapple with. And now the big thing, and if you allow me to kind of dive into AGI, because that's obviously a huge topic in itself, but if we talk about these major trends from D2C to and that's all in the commerce space, to omnichannel integration and integration on online, offline channels, etc. I mean, generative AI is really the next big thing, right? And again, this is where a lot of retailers and brands are somewhat struggling. Everyone is somewhat aware of at least the major tools that are out there. Most people nowadays already use at least conversationally tools like ChatGPT, right? But these are only the first steps. And this is not a systematic approach yet to really leveraging these tools to achieve actual business goals. And the business goals can be improving user experience, increase revenue, improve bottom line, right? Reduce costs. And this is where some of the topics that we focus on a lot, because I believe nowadays, especially with a smaller team, you can be a lot more agile, right? Because we're not held back by businesses, legacy structures. And I think this is really a big advantage, right? And something that we have seen being very positively received by, the market.
You mentioned AGI. Let's talk about AI in the context of commerce. What are practical applications of artificial intelligence within the commerce space, and what is hype?
Well, I think a very good guideline for the importance of AI and Gen AI is that many people, overestimate the current capabilities of AI and Gen AI, but underestimate the impact, at least medium to long term, right? And I think this is a good guidance rule as well, because on the one hand, it's not like I can immediately change everything that we do nowadays. It does it to a certain degree. But for a lot of the things that a typical manager would do, or a business owner, or an e-commerce operator, there's still a human element to it, right? However, I think this shouldn't take away from the fact that some of these changes are happening at really unprecedented speed. And there's always going to be different cohorts of, companies that adapt to these changes. There will be some companies that are really at the forefront of some of these changes, sometimes a little bit too early before even there's a consumer, acceptance. The majority, will be in kind of the follower group. They will see first whatever has become established. They will also use or have to use, will be forced to use. Otherwise, they will be forced out competitively. And then the ones that are going out of the market because they're not able to keep up with the changes, right? Maybe because they don't want to, because they don't have the means to invest, or lack of knowledge or whatever. But I think with a lot of the AI tools and Gen AI tools, we've come to stages where the broad pool of followers are in the process of really leveraging some of the these technologies. So very simple example, because this is almost too commonplace nowadays to really matter, is really content creation for an e-commerce site. Whereas the copy for product descriptions, marketing text previously had to go through multiple processes. Nowadays the cycle has shortened a lot, where maybe AI is not the final approver, but at least can provide 90% of text. You still have the human approval level, but this obviously shortens a lot, the time. And again, both the curse and the blessing, because it will lead to so much more content that is created, but it forces every retailer as well to keep up with it, because if everyone else is doing, you can't be left behind. But there's all the other things in terms of how to proactively guide customers, understand their needs, their requirements, what they're actually looking for, and guiding them in terms of their shopping journey. I think these are things that will become really important, right? And the product recommendations, also content that's created on the fly, right, based on whatever is requested from customer, whatever demand is identified. Nothing is spared, really. If you look at everything that constitutes an online retail business, obviously there's so much more. It's like the tip of the iceberg, right? And if you operate an e-commerce business, you know this, right? What the customer sees obviously is really just the tip of the iceberg. Everything that happens behind it is really key to success as well, right? The whole supply chain, the whole setup behind the curtain. But again, so much has happened here where integrations have become, much more easier for brands to actually, integrate, the different data sources, tools, etc., without necessarily having to activate a big tech team and do things like, for example, demand forecasting, right? Which again, previously maybe would have required a lot of effort, very complicated tools. I think a lot of these things will just become table stakes, right? And why I think this is the case is also because a lot of these are now being natively integrated in either the commerce platforms. If you look at Shopify nowadays, I mean, not just Shopify, right? All the commerce platforms, they all have AI integration, Gen AI integration already. Marketplaces as well, they help you now with, creating product descriptions. They help you with competitor intelligence. All these things will become very commonplace. I can't understate the importance, I think, especially medium to long term.
Speaking of trends, I mean, AI doesn't feel like a trend. It is really just another form of our technology evolution, but it is somewhat a trend nowadays. But let's talk about trends, especially sitting out of Asia, where a lot of e-commerce trends are being born out of. Can you talk us through a little bit about what these are and what you think are here to stay, or what is hype?
Yeah, I think there are definitely some broad trends that are just very important for retailers to, or any brands to consider and be aware of. We talked about AI. I mean, this is not Asia specific in any way. This is really a global trend. Again, the details to that may differ from market to market, and China will probably be on a different trajectory here, right? Because some of the AI tools are different, but I think the general considerations are the same. But there are also other aspects that are maybe even a little bit more important in East Asia markets vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Right? Social commerce, for example, is a good example, right? Social commerce, which to a certain degree also includes, live commerce, live streaming, live shopping. It's just so much bigger in this region and compared to the rest of the world. And again, maybe it's just because of how consumers became familiar and the first touch points they had actually with buying online. If you compare it to a lot of the Western markets, e-commerce really became a thing and it became a significant revenue driver for brands and retailers, but also important for consumers as considerations versus a trip to a retail store. At that time, maybe social media, for example, wasn't as prevalent yet, which was very different in Southeast Asia, for example, where really it almost started a little bit with social media, and e-commerce actually came a little bit after that. Social commerce is the social part actually came first. And it's interesting because even some of the early commerce in Southeast Asia, I remember back then, happened very organically through Facebook. Just they posted something on the newsfeed, hey, I have this, who wants it? And people just interacted. And that was the simplest form of commerce. But people were transacting. So from that perspective, it kind of makes sense that people in Southeast Asia just feel, these two sides, social and commerce, are just much more closely integrated, right? And if you look at even, some of the social media usage rates in terms of percentage of the population, I think globally Indonesia and Philippines are like number one, right? In terms of percentage of people who are active on the main social media platforms. So I think going forward, it will be even more important because for a couple of reasons. First of all, something I've mentioned earlier, the traditional ways of digital marketing have become quite expensive for a lot of brands, especially if you're a smaller to mid-sized brand. It's become really challenging to advertise on some of the more traditional digital channels. Small to medium-sized companies have really been crowded out, pricing-wise, right, from these digital channels. And this is beyond the fact that maybe even some search engines like Google, have never been as important in the Southeast Asian markets or most East Asian markets compared to the Western world, right? So a lot of the consumer journeys as well would start in the social space in terms of finding products, getting recommendations for products. So maybe people wouldn't start their search first on Google, but start on either on one of the marketplaces or in one of the social media channels. So it's just a different way to think about findability of product and finding out about recommendations and user experiences. And then user-generated content, I think, will become really, really important as well. Again, content is really king, right? Whether we talk about, content where AI helped to at least create 80 to 90% maybe of the initial content, but user-generated content as well. And I think there's also an authenticity factor that will be very important, especially as we see that generative AI will become better and better in actually creating not just content that feels more and more like it's really human written and authentic, but even avatars, for example, that will feel really lifelike, sometimes eerily lifelike, right? And to a degree where, and I think this is sometimes difficult for people to really comprehend that it just in the next 2 to 3 years already will have avatars that are indistinguishable from real humans. To a certain degree, it's already the case, right? But the thing I think that will be interesting to see is, what the acceptance will be of kind of that trajectory. I think it will be probably split between, some people being accepting of these changes and maybe also some trust that has to be restored, especially in authentic, like human recommendations, reviews, etc. It's already a big issue, by the way, even in the space of recommendations and product reviews, right? I mean, this is a big topic as well, where even on some of the big marketplaces, they have been flooded and it's only becoming a bigger problem, right, with product reviews that are produced by generative AI, right? So again, not specific to the market, but general comment.
Yeah, and you mentioned something about authenticity earlier, but then we started talking about things like avatars being created by generative AI. So what do brands need to do to adapt and tread that fine line between being trusted by the consumer, because authenticity is really a key to being able to build that brand trust, but also taking advantage of all the new technology that can help with regards to bringing more recommendations or personalized experiences for that brand.
Yeah, there's probably not like one, golden rule that applies to every brand and every retailer. If we talk about different product categories or different brands, maybe address different customer groups as well. I'm not the first one to say this, but I think you already alluded to this point. Authenticity is something that is of very high value, especially to younger customers who have become just very aware of how easy it has become nowadays to be deceptive, right, about authenticity of content, right? So I think for a lot of brands and retailers, that will mean two things. On the one hand, they can't ignore the fact that Gen AI helps to just accelerate, for example, content production process, right? And this is also just a cost factor, right? Because it wouldn't be feasible anymore, like to do all this the old way, right? That there's a certain competitive pressure, then everyone has to do that as well. And that also extends to on-site experience. If we talk about D2C side, in terms of the support I get as a user, in terms of being service finding what I want in the shortest amount of time possible, getting the right recommendations, having customer service, even if it's AI powered, that can really help me, right? Again, it's a little bit haphazard right now in terms of what brands have to offer, but it's becoming better and better, right? Also with some of the integrations into, I can look up my order, I can ask a chatbot, for the status of my order and these kind of things, right? So again, will become table stakes because customers will just get used to it, right? And expect it from all brands and retailers. But I think on the other hand, brands also need to make an effort to actually really connect with their consumers, right? And connect with them authentically as well. And often that also means, that this extends and crosses also several touch points and channels, right? It doesn't have to be only through web channels. It doesn't only have to be through online channels. We talk a lot about O2O, online to offline, omnichannel strategy, click and collect, buy online, pick up in store, things like these. But I think in terms of really connecting with customers, connecting with advocates, making use of advocates as well, I think this will become very important for brands, and this will be difficult as well to delegate, for brands just to like agencies, because I think that's all part of the authenticity factors for brands to be seen as trustworthy, which again, I think is a very important value for especially young consumers.
That has been a really eye-opening conversation. Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we ended the chat?
Well, even though I've been on this whole journey and really inadvertently at the forefront of some of the changes that have happened, I want to emphasize again something I said earlier is that there are challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities, right? And things are changing very fast and maybe, ever faster than before as well. At the same time, consumer behavior does not necessarily change as fast, right? So I think sometimes companies, retailers, brands, they sometimes maybe feel a little bit like a deer in headlight, right? You see kind of the change coming. It's sometimes coming so fast that it's hard to react actually what to do. Jump, do you stand, do you, evade, kind of a fight or flight reaction. But I think trying to find a balance in this in something that we typically do as well. We have what we call commerce maturity assessment framework that we operate with. It's also something that gives clarity to retailers when we do this exercise, because we look at 3 dimensions for retailers to be successful in online commerce. First of all, the must-have stuff, the most basic stuff, but super important stuff. Site speed, for example. Sometimes it's just not addressed well enough, but it's just so important, right? Knowing that, how impatient people are, how, bad it is for search engine rating and all of these things. The overall user experience, details on the product page, ease of checkout, payment options, all the super basic things. So that's one dimension. Then there's the stuff that's just a little bit more advanced and maybe doesn't apply to all companies. Omnichannel integrations with different backend systems, automated processes. And then the third category is really more the future forward-looking stuff, right? And this is where AI, tools and processes and integrations really fall under, because a lot of this stuff, like even if you don't have it nowadays, doesn't mean like you go tomorrow out of business, but it really has to be part of the roadmap, right? And this is really important, right? To have this clarity of a roadmap, being adaptable enough, obviously, to address also, the changing landscape and external factors, etc. But having this clarity of a roadmap, right, this I think is really, really important.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Patrick. Hope you have a good rest of the holiday season. Hopefully Bangkok is a lot more fun and warm than where I'm currently sitting in London.
Thanks, Chase. Thanks for having me on. Have a great new year.
Now make sure you subscribe to Evolve Voices, this leading and incredible project where our ambassadors are interviewing amazing professionals from all over the world so they can share their perspective and benefit you with their perspective, their knowledge, and you can understand what's happening in the different markets. Evolve Voices is a project part of the Evolve Commerce Club, the #1 and leading community where we connect international professionals in the world of commerce. We are now connecting professionals in more than 40 markets, and every week we invite an expert to share their perspective and their knowledge. So if you'd like to know more, you can always look at the comments. We have a link there so you can request your application and stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks for watching. All the best. Ciao.